She was still screaming when Edward Ashworth walked through the door. He had heard it from the driveway, Victoria's voice carrying through the double-glazed front windows of the manor in a way that voices only do when the person using them has stopped caring who else can hear. He came through the entrance hall and into the kitchen and found 9 people standing in various degrees of stillness around the large central island. The 2 kitchen assistants backed against the far wall. The groundskeeper, who had no business being inside at all, his daughter Rosie pressed against the leg of Mrs. Drummond, who had one hand on the child's shoulder and was looking at the middle distance with the particular expression of someone who has been in service long enough to know that the worst thing you can do in a moment like this is look like you're watching, and at the center of it, Victoria standing at the head of the island with a glass of water she had not drunk in her right hand, and Margaret standing on the other side of it with her hands at her sides and her face entirely composed. Victoria turned when she heard him come in. "Finally," she said, "finally you're here. Tell me, Edward, tell me right now. Do you know what she's been doing? Do you know what this woman has been taking from this house?" Edward looked at Margaret. Margaret looked back at him. Her expression did not change. What he would have given later to have understood in that moment what the expression meant. Not blankness, not guilt, not the careful staging of innocence. Something else entirely. The face of someone who has already decided that what is about to happen to them is something they will survive, not because they are certain of the outcome, but because they have survived worse and know their own floor. "Margaret," he said, "what's happening?" Victoria answered for her. That was the first thing, that she answered before Margaret could speak. And her voice had the particular momentum of a person who has been waiting for an audience and is not going to yield the floor now that she has won. She laid it out. The medication missing from the cabinet in the upstairs bathroom, the prescription supplements that Edward's doctor had provided following his mother's estate settlement, the ones Victoria managed and counted and had been counting again this past week when she noticed, and then she had checked, she said. She had gone back through the household diary and the prescription logs she kept. There was a pattern, a consistent and unmistakable pattern, of the levels dropping on the days Margaret worked the upstairs rooms. "She's the only one who goes in there," Victoria said. "She's the only one I allow in that bathroom. And for 3 months, Edward, 3 months, the levels have been dropping." The room was very quiet. Outside, the grounds in the late afternoon held a particular September light, long and low and indifferent to what was happening inside the house. Edward looked at Margaret. She was looking back at him with those steady eyes, and her hands were still at her sides, and she had not said a word. "Margaret," he said again, is there anything you want to tell me?" A pause. Something moved across her face. Not uncertainty, not guilt. Something more like the careful assembling of a person who is about to say the only thing that can be said and who knows it will not be enough for this room, and says it anyway. "Mrs. Ashworth," Margaret said, and her voice was the quietest thing in that kitchen, quieter than the hum of the refrigerator, quieter than Rosie's breathing against Mrs. Drummond's side. "I have been in this house for 9 years. In 9 years, I have never taken a thing from it that was not given to me. You are welcome to search every corner I have ever touched. But I want you to know, and I want everyone in this room to know, that the loudest voice in an argument is very rarely the most honest one." The silence that followed was total. Victoria set the glass down. "Get out," she said. "Get out of this house. You're dismissed. I want you gone in the hour." Margaret looked at Edward. Edward Ashworth, who had inherited this house and the estate around it and the family name that came with both, who had run a property development company for 18 years and employed 300 people across 6 projects and prided himself on being the kind of man who made decisions on evidence rather than impulse. Edward Ashworth said nothing. He said nothing because Victoria's hand had found his arm at that moment with a grip that communicated in a register below language, and because his mother had died 4 months ago, and he had not yet learned to think clearly in a house that still held her absence like a second set of furniture, and because the medication in the upstairs cabinet had been his mother's, And the thought of it being taken, the thought of someone he trusted taking something that was Margaret's, he said, "Margaret, I think you should go home for tonight. We'll speak tomorrow." It was not a firing, he told himself. It was not a firing. It was a deferral, a cooling off, a responsible decision made in a room full of people who were all watching. He told himself this later and then stopped telling himself this because he knew what it had looked like to every person in that kitchen, and he knew what it had sounded like to Margaret, and he knew in the part of him that his mother had always said was the most reliable part, the part that knew things before the rest of him caught up, that something had just happened that could not be walked back by a phone call in the morning. Margaret picked up her bag from the hook by the kitchen door. She put on her coat, which was hanging beside it. She looked at Rosie, who was now crying quietly against Mrs. Drummond's side, and she said very gently, "I'll see you soon, sweetheart. Don't cry." Then she walked out. The door closed behind her with no more sound than a door normally makes. Rosie looked at her father. "Why did she have to go?" she said. Nobody answered. Edward did not sleep that night. He lay in the dark of the bedroom he had shared with Victoria for 4 years and listened to the house settle around him and tried to account for the feeling lodged in the center of his chest. A feeling that was not grief exactly, though it shared some of grief's architecture, and not guilt exactly, though it had guilt's particular weight. It was the feeling of a man who has done something he cannot yet name in front of witnesses and who understands that the naming will arrive eventually, whether he is ready for it or not. He thought about Margaret. 9 years. She had come to this house when Rosie was barely walking and Sam was 3 years old, and their mother had just left, and the house had a particular chaos to it that Edward had not known how to manage. Margaret had managed it without being asked to manage it, without ever making him feel that the managing was visible. She had simply been present, steady, quiet, efficient, and possessed of the specific quality that the best people in service have, which is the ability to make a house feel inhabited by care rather than merely occupied by people. He thought about the medication, about the pattern Victoria had described, about the careful logs she kept. He thought for the first time about why Victoria kept such careful logs. He did not know what to do with this thought. He put it away and got out of bed at 5 in the morning and went downstairs and stood in the kitchen where it happened and looked at the hook by the door where Margaret's coat had been. He called her at 9. The call went to voicemail. He left a message that he listened back to immediately after ending the call and found inadequate in every particular. Too formal, too careful, too much the voice of an employer managing a situation rather than a man trying to say that he was sorry and didn't fully know what he was sorry for yet. He drove to work. He achieved nothing at work. He sat at his desk for 6 hours and moved papers from one side of it to the other and had 2 phone calls he could not afterward recall the content of. And at 4 o'clock, he told his assistant he was leaving early and got in his car and drove. He did not decide to drive to Margaret's address. That was the truth of it, which he acknowledged only much later. He told himself he was driving in no particular direction, clearing his head, doing what he sometimes did when the office became a room he could no longer think inside. The navigation system had Margaret's postcode still loaded from the previous evening's search. He had not cleared it. When the route appeared on the screen, he looked at it for a moment at the junction, and then he followed it. He drove home. He walked past Rosie's room and heard her say to Sam, in the particular confiding tone that children use when they believe no one adult can hear them, "She sits with me every night when the pain is bad. You know, she sings to her. I heard her through the wall one time when I couldn't sleep. She thinks nobody hears." Edward stopped outside the door. "Who sings to who?" Sam said. "Margaret. To her daughter. I heard it through the wall of the spare room. That time I had the bad ear and I couldn't sleep, and I went to get water and I heard her through the walls. A song I didn't know. She was very quiet about it." Edward stood in the corridor, and the house was silent around him except for the television downstairs and the sound of his own breathing. He had not known Margaret had a daughter. In 9 years, he had not known. He went back downstairs and opened his laptop and looked up Margaret Osei in his household files. The folder Victoria managed, as she managed most of the household administration. As she had managed it since they married, and he had been glad to hand it over because he was better at buildings than at people. And he had always known this about himself. The file had Margaret's address, her start date, her rate of pay, her annual leave record. That was all. There was no next of kin listed, no emergency contact, 9 years of service, and the file was 4 lines. He wrote down the address. He told himself he was going to apologize in person. That was what he told himself as he got in the car and entered the postcode into the navigation system and pulled out of the estate drive into the lane that led toward the village and then beyond the village into the part of the county that the estate maps. Had never found reason to detail the navigation, took him through the market town and then through the far edge of it and then along a road that narrowed gradually, not in a single moment, but continuously, lane by lane, margin by margin, until the hedges were closer than comfortable and the road's surface changed texture under the wheels in the houses when they appeared, sat closer together and lower to the ground, and carried the particular quality of places that have never been photographed for any purpose except insurance. He passed a row of terraced houses with a single shared parking strip. He passed a convenience shop with its lights on and its door wedged open. He turned onto a street that the sat-nav named and then seemed to lose confidence in, the blue line thinning slightly as though uncertain of its own route. Number 31 was mid-terrace, narrow frontage, a window box with something growing in it that had been better cared for than the woodwork around it. The door was painted a specific shade of yellow, not a casual yellow, a chosen yellow, the kind that takes deliberate effort in a terrace where every other door is white or brown or the non-color of surfaces that have simply not been painted recently. Someone had decided that this door would be this color. Someone had bought the tin and applied 2 coats and cleaned the brush afterward. There was a light on upstairs. Edward parked and did not get out immediately. He sat with the engine off and looked at the house and thought about what he was doing and arrived at no useful conclusion. He was here because of what Rosie had said. He was here because of the empty look on Margaret's face when she had not said anything to stop her. He was here because in the morning, in the kitchen before anyone else arrived, he had opened the medicine cabinet and looked at the prescription bottles inside and thought, very quietly, the way you think things you're not ready to say aloud, that he could not actually identify any meaningful reason why levels would drop in 3-month cycles if what was happening was simple theft. He got out of the car. He held the door for a moment after closing it, one hand resting on the roof, steadying himself without quite admitting that steadying was what he was doing. He walked to the side of the house rather than the front door, not entirely intentionally, following the narrow gap between the terrace and its neighbor that led to a small back garden. He stopped where the path ended and the garden began at the low wooden gate that was standing slightly open. The navigation took him through the market town and then through the far edge of it, and then along a road that narrowed gradually, not in a single moment, but continuously, lane by lane, margin by margin, until the hedges were closer than comfortable and the road's surface changed texture under the wheels and the houses, when they appeared, sat closer together and lower to the ground, and carried the particular quality of places that have never been photographed for any purpose except insurance. He passed a row of terraced houses with a single shared parking strip. He passed a convenience shop with its lights on and its door wedged open. He turned onto a street that the sat-nav named and then seemed to lose confidence in, the blue line thinning slightly as though uncertain of its own route. Number 31 was mid-terrace, narrow frontage, a window box with something growing in it that had been better cared for than the woodwork around it. The door was painted a specific shade of yellow, not a casual yellow, a chosen yellow, the kind that takes deliberate effort in a terrace where every other door is white or brown, or the non-color of surfaces that have simply not been painted recently. Someone had decided that this door would be this color. Someone had bought the tin and applied 2 coats and cleaned the brush afterward. There was a light on upstairs. Edward parked and did not get out immediately. He sat with the engine off and looked at the house and thought about what he was doing and arrived at no useful conclusion. He was here because of what Rosie had said. He was here because of the empty look on Margaret's face when she had picked up her coat and he had not said anything to stop her. He was here because in the morning, in the kitchen, before anyone else arrived, he had opened the medicine cabinet and looked at the prescription bottles inside and thought, very quietly, the way you think things you're not ready to say aloud, that he could not actually identify any meaningful reason why levels would drop in 3-month cycles if what was happening was simple theft. He heard her voice before he saw anything. Low and steady and pitched for close range. The voice you use in a room where the person you are speaking to is the only audience that matters. He could not hear the words. He could hear the tone, unhurried, deliberate, the specific cadence of someone reading aloud or recounting something, sentence by patient sentence, with pauses that had the quality of listening in them. Then, another voice, younger, tired in the way that tired in a young person sounds different from tired in an adult, thinner, closer to the surface, the tiredness of a body working harder than it should have to. He moved to the garden gate. Through it, he could see the back of the house, the kitchen window lit and uncurtained, and through it, the back room which served as a sitting room. A sofa, a lamp on a small table, a bookcase with its contents not quite orderly, and on the sofa, under a blanket, a girl. 17 perhaps or 18, the age where youth and something older are in the same face at the same time. She was pale in the way that has a cause behind it. Her hair was loose, and she had it pulled over one shoulder, and she was holding a cup of something warm and looking at Margaret, who was in the armchair beside her with what appeared to be a printed sheet, a medical document, dense, with small type, which she was reading aloud from or translating from, going slowly, stopping to explain. On the side table next to the girl's sofa, a small orange prescription bottle. Edward could see the pharmacy label from where he stood. He could see the name of the compound on it. He could not see the dosage or the quantity, but he did not need to. He understood in the specific and total way that understanding sometimes comes, not built from pieces, but arriving complete, what he was looking at. He stood at the garden gate and watched Margaret set the printed sheet down and reach over and adjust the blanket where it had slipped from the girl's shoulder. A gesture so practiced, it was not a gesture anymore. Just the thing a person does when they know a body's habits, which shoulder the blanket always slips from, which position produces comfort, how long the warmth of a cup of tea will last before it needs replacing. The girl said something, a question, he could hear the question shape of it without the words. Margaret answered. He heard only the last part, carried by some trick of the window angle. Not for much longer. I promise you that. Then the girl said clearly enough that it came through the window without difficulty. Mum, you don't have to keep doing this on your own. The gate was at his back. He stepped away from it. He pressed himself against the wall of the neighboring house and stood there in the dark of the gap between the terraces and became aware, in a slow and devastating way, of what his body was doing. His legs were not entirely reliable. His back found the brick wall, and he let it take the weight of him, while the part of his brain that normally managed the weight of things performed, for a moment, no useful function at all. A daughter, a sick daughter, managing a condition whose medication cost money Margaret did not have on the wage his household paid her, a wage that Victoria managed as she managed all household administration, and which Edward had not reviewed in 3 years because he trusted Victoria's management. 3 months of the prescription levels dropping. 3 months of Lily's condition requiring the specific compound that sat in the upstairs cabinet in quantities that exceeded what Edward or Victoria used, and that had, he understood this now, never been properly inventoried because Victoria managed the cabinet as she managed everything, and no one had thought to ask why she kept such careful logs except to present them when they were needed. He could not tell you how long he stood between those two houses. Long enough that the light in the upstairs window of number 31 went off, long enough that a cat crossed the garden gate twice without concern for his presence. Long enough that by the time he walked back to his car and sat in it and put both hands on the steering wheel, the street was quiet in the way streets get quiet late in the evening. Not silent, not empty, but turned inward, attending to its own business. He drove home. He did not go upstairs. He sat in the kitchen at the island where it had all happened, and when the morning came, he was still sitting there. Victoria found him at 6:30. She was already dressed. She rose early, always had, and she took in the fact of him at the kitchen island with the particular stillness of a person who is assembling information before they speak. She said, "Have you been here all night? Sit down," he said. Something in his voice made her sit. He had spent the night in a variety of mental states, not all of them productive, but the one he had arrived at by 3 in the morning and stayed in for the remaining hours was clarity. Not the comfortable clarity of a decision you feel good about, but the flat, unsparing clarity of a person who has looked at something directly and decided to stop looking away. He had spent the hours between 3 and 6 reviewing documents on his phone. The household financial accounts he had not accessed in 2 years, the supplier invoices Victoria managed, the staff wage records. What he found in those records did not take long to find once he was looking. It never does, in the end. The money that had been redirected was not a large amount by the standards of his estate. It was a very large amount by the standards of Margaret's wage. Victoria listened to what he said. She listened with the expression of someone who has a response prepared and is waiting for the correct moment to deploy it. And when he finished, she began to deploy it, and he let her get 4 sentences in before he set his phone on the island between them, facing her with the accounts on screen. She looked at the screen. The response stopped. In the silence that followed, he said 2 things. The first was that he was going to call Margaret this morning and ask her to come back, and that he intended to speak to her before Victoria was present, and that he intended to do this in the kitchen in front of Mrs. Drummond and whoever else was in the house, because the same audience that had been present for the injustice would be present for its correction. The second thing he said was that he wanted Victoria out of the house before Margaret arrived. Victoria left before 9. Mrs. Drummond, who had worked in this house for 30 years and whose own dignity had been tested by what she had witnessed 2 days earlier in ways she had not expressed to anyone, watched from the entrance hall window as the car went down the drive and said nothing. Margaret came at 11. She came because he had asked her to, and because Mrs. Drummond had called her separately, which he had not known about until afterward, and said only, "Come, Margaret, it's time." She came in through the kitchen door, the same door she had walked out of 2 days before, and sat at the island, and Edward sat across from her in the same configuration as before, except that this time the room held only the 2 of them and Mrs. Drummond, who stood near the window with her hands folded. He told her everything. He told her what he had found in the accounts. He told her what he understood about the medication and what he understood about Lily, and what he understood, now too late, but fully, about the 9 years she had spent in this house and what she had been carrying inside them that no one had thought to ask about because no one had thought to look. She did not cry during any of this. She sat with the same straight-back composure she had brought into his kitchen 2 days ago and listened. And when he finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "How is Rosie?" He blinked. She's been asking about you. She has a good heart," Margaret said. "She always has. So does Sam." A pause. "I didn't take those things for myself, Mr. Ashworth. I know that. I kept a record," she said. "Every amount. Every date. I don't know what I meant to do with it. Pay it back somehow. I know that doesn't stop," he said. He slid the document across the island. He had prepared it that morning, in the hours between Victoria leaving and Margaret arriving, working with a concentration he had not applied to anything in 4 months. It was 2 pages. The first contained a formal apology from him as her employer and a reinstatement to her position, not as an obligation or a legal formality, but as a document he had written in his own words and signed with the understanding that words on paper are sometimes the only way to make a thing real that the air of a room cannot hold. The second page described the Ashworth Household Staff Medical Provision, a fund formally established, registered with his family solicitor, drawing on the estate accounts, covering full medical costs, diagnostics, treatment, ongoing management, for every person employed in the household and their immediate family members, named in the founding document, in the words of his mother, Eleanor Ashworth, Who had said at his father's funeral 20 years ago that the people who worked in a house were not separate from the house? They were the house, the warmth of it, the continuance of it, the thing that made a building into a place where people were known. Margaret read it once, then she read it again. Her hand came to rest flat on the second page, and she pressed her palm down, the way you press your hand on something you want to be real. Lily's appointment, he said. The specialist, whatever she needs, that is covered as of today. Not as charity, as what it is, what it should have been a long time ago. Mrs. Drummond, at the window, turned away and looked out at the grounds, and her shoulders moved once with something she did not allow to become audible. The days that followed had a particular quality that Edward had not expected. Not dramatic, not celebratory, but quietly purposeful in the way that things are when a course is corrected, and the correction itself becomes the work. Lily was seen by a specialist within the week. The diagnosis was confirmed, the treatment plan established, the medication properly prescribed and properly funded. She was not cured by any of this. She was managed, which is not the same thing, but is for some conditions the better gift. She came to the house once, 3 weeks later, at Margaret's side. A thin and composed young woman who shook Edward's hand and said thank you in a voice that did not quite cover how much the words cost her, and he said you're welcome in a voice that did not quite cover how much he meant it. Rosie adopted her immediately. This was not a metaphor. Rosie, who was 9 and had her father's instinct for identifying the people worth knowing, decided on the occasion of their first meeting that Lily was her person and conducted herself accordingly from that point forward. Sam, who was 12 and managed his emotions through elaborate practicality, produced a handwritten list of local university medical programs for Lily's consideration, which she accepted with the seriousness it deserved. The kitchen became, over the weeks of autumn that followed, a different room from the one it had been. Not in any physical way. The island was the same stone, the hooks by the door the same hooks, the window the same window with the same grounds beyond it. But rooms are made of more than their surfaces. They are made of what has happened in them and who was present, and whether in the end the best version of events won out. This kitchen had seen the worst version, and then, slowly and with difficulty, the better one. It held both now, the way any place holds what it has witnessed, and the better one was louder in the silence. On a Wednesday evening in November, the family table formed, not staged, not planned, but assembled by the particular gravity that families generate when they have been through something together and arrived, intact, on the other side. Edward at one end, Rosie and Sam in their usual places, Mrs. Drummond, who had been invited, Anne had said she would think about it and arrived with a pie she claimed was left over from something else. Margaret beside Lily, who had come because Rosie had called her 3 times to make sure. They ate and talked. Rosie told a long and structurally ambitious story involving a horse and a misunderstanding at her school that required several interruptions for clarification and produced laughter of the specific kind that only children can generate in a room. Unguarded, unrepeatable, the laugh of people who are not yet managing how they appear. Lily laughed too, and for a moment the pallor of the past months was entirely absent from her face, and Margaret watched her daughter laugh at Rosie's story and said nothing and did not need to. After dinner, when the children had gone upstairs and Mrs. Drummond was washing up with the particular authority of someone who does not require assistance, Edward and Margaret sat at the end of the island with tea and the comfortable quiet of people who have said the difficult things and arrived at something that does not need more words just yet. The curtain on the far window moved. There was no draft that evening, no window open anywhere in the kitchen. A single breath of movement in the fabric. Not dramatic, not sustained. One motion, and then stillness. Mrs. Drummond at the sink saw it. She turned back to the washing up and did not say anything, and did not need to say anything, because she had worked in this house for 30 years, and she had her own understanding of what moved the curtains in rooms that were otherwise still, and she had learned to receive those moments with the simple gratitude of someone who still believes in the things that cannot be put in any file. Margaret saw it too. She looked at it and then looked at her tea, and there was something in her face that was not quite a smile and not quite sorrow, but contain both, the way some expressions can. Edward did not see it. He was looking at his children's chairs, still pulled out slightly from the table, the way chairs are after children have been sitting in them, at an angle never quite returned to the position they started in, always a little closer to where someone else was sitting. And sometimes the person who has served you longest and spoken least is carrying the heaviest thing in the room, and all it takes to see it, all it has ever taken, is the willingness to follow someone home.